let's go. So what it, and by the way, this is an initiative, as a lot of you know, at Harvard Divinity School. So, you know, you can go on the website and have a look as well at what it's all about. But yeah, go. What is it about?
All right, thank you, Sophie.
That was a great question, right?
Yes, that's go. It's an imperative. I like it. Well, yeah, as Sophie said, much of what I'm going to say and my opening can be found online at the Center for the Study of World Religions website. So this is an adaptation of that. So as I mentioned this morning, the initiative studies religious and spiritual traditions and practices from across the globe and from antiquity to today that aim for the transcendence of our normal states of being, consciousness, and embodiment, and the attendant transformation of individual, community, and society. The initiative is interested in the existence of the sacred, whatever that is, different dimensions or levels of reality, seen and unseen, and different modes of access to those realities. Its aim is not only to study this reality, but also, and this is somewhat controversial, to solicit experiences and encounters with reality. This initiative investigates what might be called metaphysics and mysticism, by which we mean simply the traditions across time, space, people, that have cultivated practices of transcendence and transformation and have articulated worldviews to make sense of those practices. These practices or spiritual exercises are often termed ecstatic. That is, they usher us outside, or ek, our accustomed states of being and understanding, or stasis. There's the ecstasy, ecstasis. And they invite us into new relationship with ourselves, our fellow human beings, and our more than human neighbors, including the Earth's mineral, plant, and animal life, but also those beings we name spirits, angels, demons, and gods, visible and invisible, real and imagined, malevolent or benign. The initiative takes seriously reports of extraordinary experiences of the sacred and the changes that those experiences elicit in our minds, our souls, and indeed our bodies. And it aims to pair disciplined inquiry with an openness to the archive of those experiences, ancient and modern. It will explore different ontological and epistemological frameworks for interpreting these experiences, both appreciatively and critically. And it tries to avoid and critique dismissive or reductive frameworks, which very often predominate in the academy. Now, I also mentioned this morning, that's the sort of general blurb on transcendence and transformation. Specifically, why are we talking about embodiment? Because, as I said, there is a justified worry that transcendence involves a flight from the body. And what we are trying to do in the initiative is challenge that and to suggest, in fact, that some of the most important forms of transcendence are transcendence into other states of embodiment. And that's what we're hoping to explore over the course of the weekend. And we already did this morning. So I've chosen 5 books that are recent, and a year ago I would have chosen 5 different books. So these are books that are helping me think through transcendence and transformation right now. They were not the inspiration for the initiative, and as I said, 1 year from now, these will be a different set of books, I imagine.
Can you say a tiny bit more? You were talking about kind of, or on from what I've read previously, about the relevance to contemporary life. Mm-hmm. Can you say a bit more how that's going to play out, in terms of the initiative?
Well, what I would say is that actually experiences of the sort we're talking about are fairly common, and people in our culture don't really have permission to speak of them, and they often push them to the margins of their own life and narratives of themselves. And I think we need to surface those experiences and provide more sophisticated frameworks for putting those experiences in context and knowing how to interpret them. So to me, it has a very urgent contemporary application.
And what about the reception, though, of those experiences? People who are skeptical, who are coming to it, how do you manage that?
How do I manage skeptics?
Yeah. No, in
Gently.
terms of this.
Well, I would
Not
say
in
on one
general.
hand, I think that mounting testimony of experience, if you want to remain a diehard skeptic, you have to have some explanation for why there are so many such experiences and patterns across these experiences. I'm sure you can find means of dismissing all those experiences, but ultimately I'm not interested in trying to convince skeptics. I feel as if the aim is instead to address people who don't know quite what they think or know how to interpret what they have experienced.
Okay, that's a great introduction, thank you. Okay, so we'll go through the books, and we're going to start with the first one Charlie's recommended. It's a short one. It's called 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. It's by the Italian physicists Carlo Rovelli, and it's an excellent book, and I really recommend anybody who hasn't read it to read it, because it will bring you up to date on what physicists are saying about the state of modern physics, which actually is very difficult to understand if it's not explained by someone very knowledgeable. What does it bring to the table in terms of transcendence and transformation?
Well, I think, first of all, among the 5 books, this is the most accessible. It's beautifully written. It's written by a real maestro in the sense of not someone who's not only deeply learned in contemporary physics, but knows how to translate that for a literate but not learned audience, and that includes me. I haven't studied physics since I was in college. What it brings to the topic of transcendence and transformation is, first of all, physicists, John and I were talking at breakfast today, the line between physics and metaphysics right now is very thin. It's blurry. And that's on full display in this book. Those of you who know contemporary physics will know that there are 2 dominant and incommensurable theories at play. There's the general theory of relativity, and there's quantum mechanics. These have not been bridged. Carlo Rovelli is part of a group that's trying. There have been many efforts to try to devise a theory that could reconcile these 2, but it's still on the horizon. What interests me about him is, first of all, his unabashed interest in reality and the pluriform, reality being pluriform. That is, there are many dimensions to it. So I want to say just a few things about his view of the general theory of relativity and his view of quantum mechanics that I think is very interesting. So he's a huge fan of Einstein's 1915 essay, The General Theory of Relativity. And he says that it has a stroke of pure genius. What's the genius? That Einstein was at first looking for where is the gravitational field in space? And the great insight of the general theory of relativity, as Rovelli describes it, is that the gravitational field is not diffused through, the gravitational field is not diffused through space. The gravitational field is space itself. What follows from that is that space, time, and matter are not distinct realities. They are the components of reality, or different ways of describing the same reality. And what leapt out to me in that is that in trying to describe for us how we might imagine that, he says that space-time matter is an entity that undulates, flexes, curves, and twists like a liquid. So he appeals to liquidity as the metaphor for the reality that the general theory of relativity has disclosed. So hold on to that metaphor. Now we switch to quantum mechanics in lessons 2 and 4. And I'm not the one to do justice to quantum mechanics, but one way to describe it is that it discloses that the essential reality of a system is indescribable. There is no stable account you can give of quanta, of these particles. Everything that exists is never stable, he says, and is nothing but a jump from one interaction to another. He says of that reality, the lesson of quantum mechanics is that reality is only interaction. Reality is only interaction. And just as he had with the theory of relativity, the metaphor he appeals to make sense of that is the sea, is liquid. He says, just as you look at the calmest sea, but you know that as it sways and trembles, however slightly, he says, the fields that form the world are subject to minute fluctuations, and it's possible to imagine its basic particles having brief and ephemeral existences continually created and destroyed by these movements. In other words, he says, the world is a continuous, restless swarming of things, a continuous coming to light and disappearance of ephemeral entities. So what's curious to me about Rovelli is incommensurate theories of reality delivered by modern physics, and yet in his account of them, he appeals to water as the metaphor to make sense of both. And if any of you know the pre-Socratics, pre-Socratic thinkers, it's hard not to think about the Anaximandar fragment. Actually, Rovelli wrote his first book on Anaximandar. And the first of the so-called pre-Socratic sages, Thales, who said that everything is water. Now, I'm not claiming that Thales anticipated modern physics, but it is a kind of thrilling analogy, synchronicity. So that's what really leapt out to me in Rovelli's book.
Throughout the book, he just has a really nice way of putting things. So one quote that I took out while I was reading it is he writes, "Ever since we discovered the Earth is round and turns around like a mad spinning top, we have understood that reality is not as it appears to be."
Yes.
And the whole book is written in that kind of very accessible way. And it's the first time I kind of vaguely could get a grasp on relativity is reading this book. So I think that that's really his skill.
I thought of you, Sophie, because when you said last night that you believe we are, we're really just atoms, but one of the challenges of modern physics is we don't really know what atoms are, or even if we do, that's irreconcilable with the theory of general relativity. So if you want to be a material reductionist, what are you reducing to?
Yeah, well, this is getting sidetracked a little bit, but this is where Elizabeth's analogy of me and the dog comes in. When our dog trots by our television while we're watching TV, it has no idea what's going on, but the television is there. And that's how I feel about the universe. I have no idea what's going on. And I'm just like the dog trotting around happily, focusing on food and things that I can manage.
I think we're all dogs in that analogy, but.
And also, and I've read I have read Socrates and stuff, but, my position as a skeptic was actually very different from the first poem that Elizabeth read this morning, which is, we think we know. I mean, my position as a skeptic is the opposite. It's like, I have no idea, Now, Newton kind of made sense to me. 20th century physics has gone crazy. Nobody understands it, not even Einstein. And, I think that's the way, I agree with Socrates saying, like, the only thing we really know, not that he said that exactly, but the only thing we really know is that we know nothing. I think that's the skeptic's position, rather than, okay, an atom is an atom and there's no God, and, So just to clarify my position quickly. Okay, so with that going off on a tangent, let's go on to the life of plants and metaphysics of mixture.
Do you want to hold these up,
so this is by Emanuele Coccia, who is an associate professor in Paris, but I don't know what his profession is. Is he an anthropologist?
He is a philosopher, but unlike so many philosophers who have taken an interest in plants, he was actually trained as a botanist. So before we dive into the book, I think one thing to highlight is that he is part of a sort of a trend of people who are thinking about animals, humans' porous relationship to animals and plants. This is sometimes goes under the name of the non-human turn or the post-human turn. And unlike the post-human singularity folks who imagine that the human consciousness will be downloaded into a microchip, this post-humanism is wants to think about humans, especially modern tendency to isolate themselves or define themselves over and against the plant and animal world from which we've emerged. So there's a host of people who are trying to undo that several hundred-year trend. I picked Kochia, and I should say that whole movement has been enormously influential on me and a number of the people who are associated with the initiative. I picked Kochia because I just read it 3 weeks ago and loved it. So what I want to highlight in this book is that he calls to mind the fact that plants and photosynthesis in particular have been responsible for the transformation of the earth into an atmosphere of breath, of breathing, or pneuma in the Greek. And those of you who know the Greek tradition know just how much work that word pneuma or pneuma does in Christianity and Greek metaphysics. So he makes the point that we and plants, we contain, that is to say, we breathe in our lungs that which contains us, the air. We contain our own container. And that means we are each and all of us immersed in air. And so he takes that fact, immersion, as a first principle of the world. For there to be a world, a living world, we have to recognize that it is predicated on immersion. And then he takes Darwin's conjecture. Darwin hypothesized about the origins of life, that comes out of water. I don't remember the exact phrase, but something like shallow pools somewhere or other. That some version of that, my understanding, is still predominant today. That is that I think the dominant hypothesis is that geothermal heat vents deep in the ocean are the likely spot for life's emergence. So he takes that idea, but he really creatively adopts it and adapts it. He says, all right, immersion is the condition of life. The significance of that is not the particular kind of matter in which we are immersed, that is to say, water. The significance of the condition of life is immersion in air. Or water, it doesn't matter, we're immersed in it. He says, actually, the fish is the paradigm of life, because just like we contain what we are contained in, a fish contains what it's contained in. And so that allows him to build up what he calls this metaphysics of mixture, that entities are not separate. The world is not constituted by separate entities in a void interacting with each other. They are essentially points in an immersive wave. Now, one way to put that is we're all mixed up with each other, quite literally. There are no stable entities, but only interactions. Now that sounds remarkably like what Rovere said earlier about reality is only interaction. Everything that exists is not stable, but a jump from one interaction to another. One last thing in Kochia's book that I found really interesting is he wants to highlight how organic life on Earth, which is this crust across, around the planet, is concretized sunlight. And plants played the crucial role in transforming, terraforming the Earth. It is a living deposit of our nearest star, the sun, and a deposit made possible by plants and thereafter animals through photosynthesis. So the 20th century phenomenologist Husserl tried to suggest that we need to overturn the Copernican revolution and recenter the Earth. There's a kind of a geocentric intervention he tried to make, which is very interesting. It's a really interesting provocation that Husserl made. Kochia says, no, we have to do the opposite. We have to reinvigorate the Copernican revolution, but not just by understanding ourselves as some sort of nice little orbiting planet, but that we are concretized sunlight. Quite literally, we are stardust, or rather, we're star dirt. And that's like the condition of understanding life on Earth.
As I was reading it, I mean, I do eat meat, but I already obviously have severe doubts that we should be doing that. But then when I was reading this, it's like, oh my goodness, I shouldn't really be eating plants either.
Well, maybe we should. I don't know that he wants us to stop eating each other. We're all mixed up together. I think the question is whether eating meat is, well, as we're getting off topic, but whether not eating meat is a matter of how the production of meat functions in this world, or whether one should privilege animal life over plant life in the economy of consumption. I don't have a view on that, but I think those are two different issues.
Okay, so shall we go? Okay, so the next book Charlie's going to be talking about is called Cannibal Metaphysics by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is a Brazilian anthropologist. So yeah, tell us how this book fits in and why we should be reading Cannibal Metaphysics.
All right. In order to walk you into Cannibal Metaphysics, I want to say something about this, the center that I direct in its name. So it's the Center for the Study of World Religions. Now that category, world religions, has a very complicated and genealogy, just like subtle body. What are the world religions? So the big five, as they're often described, are three Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and then Buddhism and Hinduism. It's rare, you'll never see a list of the world religions that doesn't include those big five. Then it gets more complicated, and people will argue for Taoism, Jainism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, Baha'i. And this Center for the Study of World Religions was founded at a time precisely when the Divinity School at Harvard was not interested in studying anything other than Christianity. So it was something of a revolution at the time. Let's study the world religions. But one of the liabilities of the category of the world religions, of course, is what does it exclude? It excludes, among other things, indigenous worldviews, whether we want to label those religions or not. Interesting question. Other traditions that have been labeled animist, excludes those. Shamanism. All of these are very contested categories, but the world religions lens does not, in fact, capture everything of human culture that we might want to label spiritual or religious. At the very least, whether we label them those or not, they are sophisticated worldviews. So one of the things that the initiative is committed to is trying to move those traditions out from the darkness that the lens of world religions has rendered them into the light. And so who is Eduardo Viveiros de Castro? He's a Brazilian anthropologist, as Sophie said, whose book is sometimes credited with, or it's part of what's sometimes called the ontological turn in anthropology. I'm not really qualified to speak about that whole turn in anthropology, and that's not principally why I'm interested in it. I'm interested in it because he takes up essentially a project that has been abandoned, I think, a project that I associate with Claude Lévi-Strauss, the sort of father of structuralism, anthropological structuralism, which is to take quote-unquote natives as thinkers. Claude Lévi-Strauss has a famous book called La Pensée Sauvage, Savage Thinking, Savage Thought. And Cannibal Metaphysics is clearly playing with that same idea. The idea is, the way this opens is, can anthropology be philosophy? And what he means by that is not just can anthropologists be philosophers, but can anthropology recognize that its quote-unquote subjects are themselves philosophers? Cannibals are metaphysicians. Savages are thinkers. And that the philosophy that emerges in anthropology is a kind of co-creation between a Western discipline of anthropology and these indigenous worldviews. Now, I'm just going to tell you, this is a difficult book. It's quite a difficult book, so I don't know that I can recommend it as beach reading or really or any kind of reading, to be honest. It's demanding. But I'm going to tell you a little vignette in it that I thought was fascinating. So again, it's something he owes to Claude Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss tells the story of in the Greater Antilles, the islands, shortly after the discovery of America, Spanish are there, and they're conducting an investigation into whether the natives have souls. Do the natives have a soul? At the exact same time, on another part of the island, the indigenous people have captured and drowned white Spaniards and are watching whether and how their bodies decompose. And Lévi-Strauss and Wonderstruck de Castro after him ask, what's going on here? We actually have two contemporary philosophical investigations, one by the Spanish clergy, the other by the indigenous, and look how remarkably different they are. What are they after? One wants to know whether these natives have souls, and the other is involved in a very different philosophical inquiry. What's that inquiry? What could we learn? What kind of metaphysics is being done by the quote-unquote natives? And what he says is, what's fascinating about this, and coming from a kind of Western Christian perspective, we understand why the Spanish want to know whether the natives have souls, because all sorts of things will follow from that. Are they included in the history of salvation? What can we do with them? Are they humans whose souls we need to care for? Are they essentially animals that we can do with as we please? That is not the question of the natives. The natives, curiously, have no doubt that these white newcomers have souls. Having a soul is not a great accomplishment in native metaphysics because it's an animist worldview. Of course they have souls. So do animals, so do plants, so do stones. The fact is not whether or not the Spanish have souls. The question is, what kind of bodies do these souls have? And how can we possibly interact with them unless we know what kind of bodies they have? So they perform experiments on them. They experiment on their body. Do they decompose like we do? If not, how should we comport ourselves? And what Wonderstruck de Castro writes of this, he says, where the identities of objects and substances come first for us, identities and substances prior, those are the questions we're interested in. In indigenous perspectivism, they're second, because each soul only knows who and what it is on the basis of what its body looks like from the perspective of another soul, which only knows itself on the basis of how its body is seen from the outside. And on that worldview, difference and relation are primary. So again, the primacy of relation coming up. So I was fascinated by this, not only because of the through line of relationality, but because it inverted our assumptions about what is important in asking after body and soul.
And well, I very much liked it because I think it almost, it was hard to read, but it almost goes without saying that that we're all subject to groupthink of some sort of another, and so all the idea that you can learn from how people who aren't part of that groupthink are thinking about the world is the answer to his question is yes, you can learn an incredible amount from studying other systems and things like that.
So one of the most controversial things in philosophy is the discipline of philosophy is it just a tradition that comes out of Greece and essentially the inheritance of Greece? That's what we should call philosophy. That's where the term was coined. Or should we look to Islamic philosophy, which actually is also largely derived from Greece? Chinese philosophy. Does the word philosophy capture what these different traditions are? These guys are saying there are many, many more philosophical traditions if we can expand the envelope of what we think of as philosophy, instead of thinking, and instead regarded as just sophisticated thought and worldview. That's kind of fun.
Okay, so we're on to the fourth of our 5 books. So this is that Divine Mania. So this is about ancient Greece, the alteration of consciousness in ancient Greece by Julia Ustinova. Okay, so tell us about Divine Mania and how it relates.
All right, so Julia Ustinova is an Israeli scholar who, this is her second monograph. The first one, which I want to mention because of something Francis said earlier today, her first one is on caves and the Greek mind. It's about basically traditions of ecstatic practice that center around dark places, what Peter Kingsley calls the dark places of wisdom. Sometimes this is called incubation cults, when you sleep in caves in hopes of soliciting an encounter with the god. So she is kind of continuing this work. That was a kind of specific instance of what we call a practice of transcendence and transformation in ancient Greece around caves. This is much more of a survey. And she's trying to push back against a narrative of ancient Greece as a bastion of reason, rationality, and form. And that first of all, I'd say that project of trying to push back against a kind of Philhellenic fetish of Greece goes back to Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy in 1872, which was his dissertation, by the way. It's absolutely insane. And he wrote it when he was like 24. So we can all hate him. And Nietzsche was pushing back against this idealization and idolization of Greece as the source for Western Europe's rationality and scientific spirit. That is there in ancient Greece, but ancient Greece also was committed to recycle that phrase, the dark places of wisdom. So what she does in this book is leans into all the ways in which the ancient Greek culture, and here she's really dealing with the 6th through 4th century BC, so this is the classical period, are interested in cultivating alterations of consciousness, and that's how she defines mania. So mania is the word, as we probably all know, that from which we get madness. I mean, that's the mania. But the Indo-European root, men, which means something like active mental force in Greek, gives us mania, which means madness, menos, mental force, and mneme, which means memory. So these are all cognate terms: madness, mentality, and memory, from a single Indo-European root, men. So, she shows over a course of many chapters the ways in which Greece has had a very, very sophisticated practices of achieving these alterations of consciousness. One thing I thought was fun is that she introduces this distinction between monophasic and polyphasic cultures. And all that means is monophasic or polyphasic is one or many states. Are these cultures that are comfortable with and cultivating a variety of states or not? And it's pretty remarkable because pre-imperial Rome, Republican Rome, is a decidedly monophasic culture, extremely worried about alterations of consciousness. And this is one of the ways in which Republican Rome differs from classical Greece, which she makes the claim. And that was interesting to me because it's a very simplistic distinction, and of course it's not one or the other, but is that a helpful diagnosis for our own culture? Is it a way of thinking about our own culture, our own subcultures? Are we monophasic or polyphasic? Now that all changes when the Republic falls and we enter the imperial age and the Hellenistic era, where Rome becomes an absolute epicenter of altered states of consciousness, largely because of the influx of Greek thinking, but also cults from the East. So the mystery cults are a big culprit here. And a lot of Roman literature is given over to lamenting how Roman values have been undermined by alterations of consciousness. Now, some of the things that I wanted to highlight from her book are more methodological, and they reminded me of what I found so interesting about Frances's book. So she's pretty solidly a humanist, trained as a philologist and a classicist, but she's trying to bring in contemporary science. That is to say, combining traditional historical methods with things like neuroscience, cognitive science, and psychology to understand better altered states of consciousness. And her approach is also what she calls phenomenological, where what she understands by that is she tries to understand these phenomena, these altered states of consciousness, how they were felt and perceived by the people who experienced them and their communities. Now that may seem basic, but that's actually quite revolutionary in scholarship, to try to recover the experiences of ancient peoples. There's been a kind of predominant, wariness of getting at experience in the humanities for some time. And there's a story as to why that is the case. Has something to do with the linguistic turn. But I found quite nice that she has taking experience as a category to be taken seriously and rigorously studied. And then there's one final thing I'll say about her method, which I found really helpful. For those of us who work in the ancient world, we're dealing often with very scant evidence. Right? You can have decades or centuries where you have this or that, or fragments, right? As opposed to places where there is more ample evidence. And she introduces a distinction between cable and chain methodology. So a chain methodology is you establish a link, you know that link, and then you build on that link. And you add another link. But the integrity of the chain depends on the strength and the integrity of each and every link in that chain. But what if you can't make a chain link? And she says, well, we have to develop a method of cabling, which is a cable is not built that way. A cable is built by threading and braiding different threads, and collectively they can be extremely strong. And I thought that was an interesting methodological provocation, especially for those of us who work in those centuries with thinner evidence. And
do you have a sense of how the book was received? You know, do you feel this is very strong? Okay.
It's just been released. I can tell you that I think it's being very well received. And I don't know how it's being received among classicists, although she has kind of impeccable credentials as a classicist. So, and I think that the old kind of Phil-Hellenic model of Greece as the bastion of Apolline rationality has long been destroyed. So there aren't quite the defenders of that anymore.
Okay, so let's go on to the fifth book. You might have heard of it before. It's called The Subtle Body, and it's by someone called Simon Cox, who you might have met this morning as well. We've already had quite a discussion about it, but do you want to give your account of it?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have a lot to say about this book. Okay, great. And apologies to Simon, because he's heard much of this before. I love this book, and I'm so glad Simon wrote it. We talked a bit about it Simon gave us a bit of an introduction. It has 8 chapters that cover everything from, it's largely a story of modernity, although it starts with the various Neoplatonic theories of what's called the ochema, or the vehicle of the soul, from Plato to Philoponus. And that is important because although that's the only ancient chapter in the book, it turns out that the Neoplatonic casts a large shadow over the modern reception. And then he takes up everything from the Cambridge Platonists, that's Ralph Cudworth, whom Simon mentioned today, and various other Cambridge Platonists, the sort of Renaissance England. They're really responsible for launching it. And then we go into the history of Orientalism, because it's the Orientalists who begin to apply the category of subtle body to India and China, and thereafter Tibet, and essentially are taking a Neoplatonic lens on these traditions. And then we get into the first and then second generation of theosophists, Madame Blavatsky and her crowd, whose love of the East moves from Egypt to India to Tibet. That's hers, at least. That's the itinerary of her particular fascination. And the subtle body is huge for theosophical metaphysics. Those of you who have had the pleasure or the pain of reading a lot of theosophical literature knows that it's like they're very Baroque, and they're also thousands of pages long, literally. Quite painful. But with the second generation of theosophists actually reacted against Blavatsky's fascination with the East and returned to Europe and said, what we need to find is the theosophical wisdom of our own tradition. So they tried to excavate a kind of subtle body in esoteric Christianity. The story changes when Simon takes up Aleister Crowley. And Aleister Crowley is important because he tries to just slough off this whole Neoplatonic frame, and he engages in a very unsystematic and eminently empirical experimentation with the subtle body, and that's quite thrilling. So Aleister Crowley is an important turning point. Then, as mentioned earlier, Carl Jung begins to explore the subtle body through the lens of alchemy. Again, we mentioned that that's a Greco-Egyptian term applied to Taoism, and it's that version that animates Carl Jung the most. And then finally, to bring it up to our own day, he narrates how the subtle body has traveled from the Eranos seminar in Switzerland, associated with figures like Henri Corbin, Mircea Eliade, and Gershom Scholem, to our very own Esalen Institute, which Francis mentioned, and Shravana. Where's Shravana? Shravana and I have the great pleasure of being on the board of trustees at the Esalen Institute, so it's very fun, and that's where I met Simon. So it's very fun to see Simon bring the story of the subtle body all the way up to today, where in fact we're trying to launch a new series on the subtle body. Okay, so that's just for those of you, that's the arc of this book. Now let me try and say a little bit more about what is important about the book. I mentioned earlier, I think it's clear from the list of names I've already given you that this is a genealogy of the Western theorization of the subtle body. Even as that theorization turns its attention to Eastern sources, it's asking Western questions of those Eastern sources. And as you can imagine, the answers you get will be different than if you were asking quote unquote Eastern questions of Eastern sources. So naturally, one might like to know how a genealogy of the subtle body would appear from the perspective of, say, India or China or Tibet, which are the traditions that have exercised the modern European, modern Western imagination. So what are those traditions after when they pursue the quote-unquote subtle body? And is that even the right category to name that pursuit? So those 8 chapters that Simon so artfully does are, I mentioned this earlier today, they can be divided up according to this distinction. It's actually not Simon's, it's Wouter Hanegraaff's from the University of Amsterdam. a distinction between Platonic and alchemical cosmologies. What do I mean by that? Okay, so this Neoplatonic concern, which overshadows the modern Western theory, the Western body, is really concerned with how could, this goes to John's question earlier, how could something so different as the soul inhabit the body? The soul and the body are incommensurable. There is an ontological divide between these two. And they posit the ohema, or the vehicle of the soul, as a kind of intermediary. It's this sort of shell or chariot that allows the soul to live in the body. So they're trying to overcome or mediate between a soul-body dualism. And it's top-down. How does the soul enter the body? The alchemical, well, and I should say that you can see that frame overshadows so much of the Western obsession with the subtle body until Crowley. So then you get into the alchemical figures like Crowley, Jung, and Michael Murphy of Esalen. These are operating with a bottom-up approach. He says, in contrast to the Platonic downward motion, the alchemical cosmos is upward tending, based on metaphors of birth, gestation, and generation, and they use these to elucidate how our reality could be the matrix of superior or even divine realities. So the genealogy that Simon traces is largely the Platonic, although the alchemical comes in at the end. What you may notice in this is the near complete absence of the Abrahamic traditions. Judaism and Christianity and Islam are really not central parts of this genealogy. And I think that owes to the Platonic premise of the book, that the subtle body in the West is largely variations on the Neoplatonic theory. The 6th century Christian philosopher John Philoponus declared the whole business of the vehicle of the soul. He said it's an incredible myth. And once that happens, Christianity sort of falls out of Simon's narrative. But reading Francis's book, I think we have to ask a question, which is, what if we could shift the lens away from the Neoplatonic, would the Abrahamic traditions come into clearer focus? What would it look like to look at the history of Christianity through a different lens? What if we looked for the Christian subtle body elsewhere? Say in the gospel accounts of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, or the Apostle Paul's meditations on the variety of bodies, earthly, heavenly, psychic, spiritual. Or, my favorite, the stories of the early desert fathers and their supernormal powers, including their turning into fire. That's my own personal favorite. So would the Western subtle body come into better view with a slightly different lens? And I know the history of Christianity better than I know the history of Judaism and Islam. What would be the appropriate questions or lenses that would render those traditions more legible? Okay, so that's essentially unfair because I'm putting to Simon, I'm saying, Simon, here's a book you didn't write. But let's get back to the book Simon did write, which is this one. And what I love about this book is the way in which Simon, especially near the end, brings in his own autobiography, as he did this morning. He includes these reflections on what led him to pursue the theory and practice of the subtle body as a child, an adolescent, and an adult, and where that pursuit took him and why. You heard a version of that. Largely it was the world of martial arts, and then later graduate school, where he learned all the languages that allowed him to do this kind of textual genealogy. But I want to just end, if I may, by talking about the end of Simon's book. So he speaks of how he came to graduate school with basically alchemical assumptions about the subtle body, right? He just spent all this time in China doing Taoist exercises. That approach met another reality in graduate school, where he encountered essentially a set of Platonic assumptions about the subtle body. So these two worldviews crashed. That second one is what he describes as an autonomous system that might interface with our fleshly bodies, but could in principle live apart from them. It's a permutation of the Neoplatonic ochema. He says this is a parallax in discourses. That is, that a parallax in discourse that's itself downstream of a parallax in ontologies. It's almost as if our two eyes did not yield a single visual field, but they delivered independent streams of content. One alchemical, one Neoplatonic. So with one eye, we strain to see that alchemical subtle body, something we build up or we bring into being through experimentation and practice. With the other eye, we see this Platonic subtle body, something that we have always already been, that's always already been there, accompanying us, mediating between our soul and our fleshly body. But both eyes run the risk of presuming that there's a single and stable object of vision, a single subtle body, whether it's made or discovered. But curiously, it's that idea that there is a single and stable subtle body that Simon gives up on the end. The genealogy of the subtle body doesn't deliver us a single ancestor, or even two ancestors. So just as he discovers that the genealogy hasn't delivered what he'd hoped, or at least at first, he begins to articulate his own creative and constructive ontology and epistemology of the subtle body. And that's what I want to end with, because that's what I think is most exciting about Simon's book, which is the book he's going to write next. This comes in the very last pages, and it remains nascent and a little tentative. So he insists that rather than a single stable subtle body, that there are many, many subtle bodies, and that they're everywhere. He calls this radical somatic mutability. And this condition contradicts both the reduction of our embodiment to the single biomedical body, the kind of culture that we typically inhabit, and it contradicts the New Age faith that there's a single subtle body and that all the world's traditions are just describing it from their own particular perspective. Kind of the old, a bunch of blind people touching an elephant and describing it in their own way. So he discards both of these. There are as many subtle bodies, Simon says, as we can imagine, because the subtle body is in fact created by our imagination. That doesn't mean it's not real, because that raises the question about a theory of imagination and whether the imagination makes things real. So he credits the creation of multiple subtle bodies to our dreaming and our thinking, sprinkled with energy and madness. And this is how he puts it at the last paragraph of the book. The subtle body is what the subtle body does. The point is that there are many of them, and that their being follows from action. And so any map of them is always changing. So that brings us to his second concluding point, that the body itself, subtle or gross, is not an object, not a single self-identical entity perceived in time. It is not an object in a uniform Newtonian historical space. Cue up Rovere again, okay? It's not an object in that way. The same goes for the multiplicity of subtle bodies. Even if there are many of them, they aren't exactly objects we create or discover. In the end, Simon sheds an epistemology of objects, just like much of contemporary physics has shed an epistemology of objects, just like Kochia has shed an epistemology of objects. But in Simon's case, it's in favor of an epistemology of persons. Bodies aren't objects, they're persons. Now, what does that mean? I suppose it means that they're subjects, that they have their own aims and purposes, their own relations and responsibilities to other subjects, other bodies. Now, this has a lot of resonance with what's often called neo-animist ontologies, that is, attempts to reboot animism, take it seriously, much of which we owe to indigenous and especially shamanic traditions. But Simon floats this idea of bodies as persons, subjects rather than objects, on the last page or two of the book. It's very suggestive, but it's also undeveloped, promissory. So I wanted a fuller articulation, left wondering, what are its implications? So Simon's got this constructive proposal advanced in tentative steps at the end of the book, It includes such tenets as radical somatic mutability and multi-natural somatic pluralism. Those are catchy. And as far as I can gather, because I'm not sure I know, but this is what I gather it means. We can create subtle bodies, and different cultural conditions enable the creation of different subtle bodies. Subtle bodies are not neutral objects, but very much interested parties, persons. And subtle bodies are gateways to other worlds, alternate realities. This sounds enormously interesting and promising, a new ontology and a new epistemology of the subtle body, but it fits a little oddly into the genealogy he's just prepared, which was overdetermined by Platonism and which alchemical experimentation is fighting for air, fighting for space. So Simon, and I know this is unfair because this is an interview of me and I'm just passing it over to Simon. What I want to hear from Simon is, can you say more about this creative and constructive proposal, which seems to be another book, or rather the seed of another book, planted in the rich soil of the conclusion of this one? What are your plans for cultivating that new shoot? That's all I got.
Should he say something?
Well, I don't know. Well, maybe we should give Simon a moment to prepare.
But, okay, a moment to prepare. So for those of us, I'd never heard of the subtle body before, and then, I've been reading in preparation for, meeting with everyone. For somebody why embark on that quest to understand it? Like, what would motivate somebody who doesn't know about it to start, understanding the subtle body?
Why, if you were firmly established in an account of the biomedical body, would you embark on a investigation into the subtle body?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say, first of all, I think that the idea that the body is nothing more than the biomedical body is fairly recent, and it has gained enormous prestige and power in our culture because of the enormous outcomes that that paradigm has yielded. So I don't want to diminish that. That's huge. We are all, Sarabin and my daughter are alive because of the realities of that paradigm and what it has afforded. Many of you in this room may have had brushes with death that you thank that biomedical body. So I don't want to diminish it. But I do think that the power and prestige that that paradigm has yields has essentially silenced knowledge of a wider envelope of embodiment. We don't even need to call it subtle, but that has been with us for a long time. And I think it's actually, more often than not, we have experiences of our body that are not easily accommodated by the biomedical model. So I would say first, why would one embark on it? Out of a curiosity of one's own embodiment, like taking seriously one's own experience of embodiment. Those don't have to be quote unquote spiritual or religious experiences. Those can be experiences had through exercise. Those can be experiences had through childbirth. Those can be experiences had through disease, trauma, and ecstasy. All of those and many more are portals to experiences of embodiment that I then think lead us to question whether our culture is giving us a thinner envelope or a narrower embodiment than we deserve. Once you acknowledge that and start looking into the archive, whether it's Eastern or Western, you're soon somewhere on this road.
Yep.
And it's not just a theorization, it's also a question of, do you want to engage it? Do you want to practice it? Do you want to cultivate it? And most people I know, when they make the turn to take those experiences of embodiment seriously, want to follow up and pursue something further. And I think you can see that that's in part that's part of what is feeding the explosion of things like yoga, mindfulness. These are modalities. These are that allow us to pursue a wider envelope of embodiment.
Okay, thank you. I think lastly, do people, I mean, a lot of people here, quite a few people here have written books, including you. I mean, do you want to say a bit about The Divine Double, your book?
Not really. I mean, I could. But Camilla's gesturing that will take us beyond the time, and it also gets Simon off the hook.
Okay.
So, got my eye on you. You know.
Should I speak up?
I would love to hear you say something.
Well, thanks for treating it, Charlie. I'm honored, man. I feel like Charlie makes it sound way more passable, plausible hypothesis than it probably actually is. But I think my meaning in like very few words. I think your appeal to, again, one of these like foundational kind of epistemological images, the blind people touching the elephant and describing it from their different angles, can gesture in this direction. Because again, that's one of the, I'm trying to overturn that image. And the one I was actually had in mind writing this was again a thing out of the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, where it's the frog in the well. And he's sitting in the well and he looks out and that's the whole world. And he kind of speculates based on what he's seeing, but he doesn't even know that elephants exist, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like taking that as a starting point, I was looking in this genealogy and found we always think of these bodies as implicated in a world, contextualized in an ontology or a cosmos. But what I did was I was trying to kind of flip that around and what if we see the body as the very plane on which the ontological is formulated or negotiated? And so just thinking of, as humans, as if we kind of take Darwin really seriously, we've evolved to see certain things for selective purposes. And lizards, all the wonderful lizards around here, I think they see a very different world. And just to loop it around to your physics stuff, Charlie, I think this dovetails with what's going on now in theoretical physics with the so-called the death of space-time. And we're discovering more fundamental physics from which space and time are actually derived. So space-time itself does not appear to be like the fundamental reality that we're living in. And I think that a lot of this subtle body stuff, as Carl Jung pointed out, he defined the subtle body as a transcendental concept by definition outside of space and time, with an appeal to Kant. So I think that we're dealing with realities that transcend the parameters of our kind of inherited Darwinian condition. And so that's why I leave it nascent, I leave it a question, because I still don't have that answer. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you. And as much as I love to talk about myself and my book, I think in the interest of time and everyone's desire to get in that pool, we should not go down that road. Thank you.